and blessings. Once again, this is Caleb Gipson, and I'm here to once again shed some light on the economic situation we're experiencing, along with helping you reach the financial freedom that hopefully you've been wanting for a long time now. Not only in America, but the world at large, we're experiencing a situation where economics have taking a turn for not necessarily the worst, but for a decreased value. I'm going to just put it like that. When tracing the cause of an event, it's always helpful to look at the history of events that possibly led to that effect. So today I aim to do that by giving a brief history, explaining how we've arrived where we are economically. When America first gained its independence from Great Britain, there was very little taxation in America for two reasons in general. Number one, the colonies' reason for breaking away from Great Britain predicated heavily upon the principle of no taxation without representation. And number two, the Articles of Confederation were the governing document of the various states at that time. The states, because of the Articles of Confederation, had so much power to act for themselves that they were all practically sovereign, while the American government itself was weak, improperly organized, and financially broke. In fact, the U.S. government had to depend on the various states for their deliberate or own voluntary will to donate some money to the U.S. government along with troops if the colonies ever would have to go to war again. Because the Articles of Confederation made the U.S. government so weak, in 1787, delegates of the states assembled for the purpose of revising the Articles. But instead of revision, fighting and debate ensued as an entirely new governing document was given life. The Constitution was born. In general, the smaller states argued that the Articles of Confederation were sound in principle, and all that was needed was a mere revision to give a legislative power, the one we now call Congress, larger powers of taxation, the power to regulate commerce, and so forth. On the other end of the spectrum, the larger states still reeked of revolution and felt that the Articles of Confederation should be set aside, giving way to a new, radically different type of government. The larger state delegates put forth the Virginia Plan, which declared that a national government composed of a supreme legislative, judiciary, and executive department should be established. After a lot of confrontation and politicking, the convention finally came to a compromise. The convention came to the resolution that the legislative department would consist of two houses. The upper house, which we now call the House of the Senate, and the lower house, which we now term the House of the Representatives. The upper house is composed of equal representation among the states, while the lower house gives the U.S. government, or the lower house gives each state a member of representatives in proportion with its respective population. The U.S. government would exact federal taxes from each state in proportion with its population size. The slave states made sure to have a provision put in the Constitution establishing that only 3/5 of the slaves would be counted in the determination of the taxable population of each state. A further compromise was reached between the states regarding the power of Congress to regulate commerce, where delegates from northern states wished to give Congress the power to regulate commerce by a bare majority. The southern states feared that this power may be employed to hurt their foreign trade and at the same time to prohibit the importation of slave labor. The difference was finally settled by the adoption of a provision in the then new Constitution that stated that Congress would have the power to regulate commerce by majority vote, but would be prohibited from restricting the importation of slaves before the year 1808. After the U.S. Constitution was ratified by the necessary number of states, it became supreme law of the land, and our legislative branch soon after began instituting federal taxation among the states. The U.S. government began legislating in such a way that made it obvious that the federal government was looking to consolidate the power of this country. From the persistent venturing to establish a national bank to the mandate of forcing state tribunals to acknowledge and respect the good faith of other states' tribunals, the federal government began to truly unify the states and strengthen the U.S. government. This sort of legislating on the federal level caused the slave states to eventually rebel because of what they considered to be a heavy taxation on their slave trade. The slave states seceded from the Union and began pushing to return the government to the way of how it functioned when the Articles of Confederation were the supreme law of the U.S. Hence the reason why the slave states became known as the Confederates. Because Abraham Lincoln had to use a militant force to combat the rebels, he levied one of the first income taxes in 1862 in order to fund all of the necessities needed by the Union soldiers for the Civil War. As I'm sure at least almost every citizen of America knows, the Union won the whole ordeal. Following the victory, Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments giving a notion of the end of slavery. In all actuality, though, slavery was far too lucrative to abolish entirely. Granted, the amendments were the first steps toward granting equality to minorities. But slavery was allowed to be perpetuated through Section 1 of the 13th Amendment, stating neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the U.S. The preceding clause made it clear that one, no matter his or her race, religion, or creed, may be enslaved if convicted of a crime. After slavery ended, the prison population skyrocketed, with the vast majority of those who were incarcerated being minorities. And as a result, the prison industrial complex replaced plantation-based slavery as a major revenue source in America. Now, before any of you get the wrong idea, this episode is about economic history, not systemic racism or political debates concerning the social condition of minorities in America. I'm simply relaying the facts of history, and I allow them to speak for themselves. But to be honest, I don't focus on racism. I see classism as the modern-day problem with the socioeconomic disparity prevailing among the various races of our country. Nowadays, people of all ethnic/racial backgrounds are trampled, oppressed, and enslaved in our society if they're poor or lacking social influence. Time and time again, innocent men and women have been enslaved within the prison industrial complex because they didn't have the money to pay for a lawyer's time or the social network to call in a favor. And just as often, I've seen people of varying races escape the clutches of imprisonment for heinous crimes they truly did commit, simply because they could easily spend tens of thousands of dollars to retain their freedom, or because they knew people who had power. So the bottom line is, if you have money and social influence, life will be easier in America for you than it will be for one who isn't as well endowed. Back to the main topic though. In 1863, the federal government, in an attempt to bring economic uniformity among the states of the U.S., passed the National Bank Act. This act provided for the federal charter and supervision of a national bank, or national banks. This allowed national banks to circulate a stable, uniform national currency secured by federal bonds deposited by each bank. While the act didn't prohibit state banks from issuing their own currency, Congress did impose a 10% tax on state banknotes that eliminated any rival currencies. But because of the inflexibility of national banknote supply and a lack of reserves, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created a Federal Reserve System to mobilize banking reserves and issue a flexible currency, Federal Reserve notes, based on gold and commercial paper. All national banks were required to be members of the Federal Reserve System, and state banks could apply for membership too. To simplify what was just said, in the beginning, gold reserves were the main currency of the U.S., and this was done by design by placing a hardship on state banks desiring to use a currency other than the currency the federal government coined. To avoid the hardship, which was a 10% tax, the state banks began conforming their currencies to the federal government's wishes. But once gold became the standard for American currency, it was found to be inconvenient and inflexible as a currency. To explicate how gold was inflexible and inconvenient, I must first explain the financial system being used by banks. This system is called the fractional reserve system. And in this banking system, banks will loan out paper notes representing the stake of gold the loanee had figuratively borrowed from the bank, and these same sort of notes would be given to those who had placed their gold in a savings. According to a fractional method, the banks were able to print up the paper notes in accordance with the amount of gold they truly possessed in their reserves. For example, say a bank had 1 million pounds of gold in its reserves, and each ounce of gold was represented by 2 banknotes. This would mean that each pound of gold was worth 32 banknotes, since there are 16 ounces in a pound. And this meant the bank had 32 million banknotes worth of gold in its reserves. Now, say this particular bank has a fractional reserve ratio of 10 paper notes to each one of the actually possessed gold-backed paper notes it distributes. This would mean that for every pound of gold in the reserves, which is 32 banknotes, which is worth 32 banknotes, the bank could print and loan out 320 banknotes for that 1 pound of gold. And if the bank charged a 5% interest on every one of the 320 banknotes, the bank would make a profit of 16 banknotes off of every pound of gold, which is half of that pound of gold's value. If this is done and paid back by every loanee of this bank, they profit 16 million banknotes off of these transactions. A problem with this sort of system was that for a while, the banks were not federally insured. So when an unfortunate occurrence wiped out the gold reserves, the bank would become essentially insolvent or bankrupt. For example, say the bank having 1 million pounds of gold had issued out all 320 million banknotes that it had been allowed to issue. If 100 million banknotes were returned for gold reimbursement all at once, the gold in the reserves would be completely exhausted, and they'd still have 68 million banknotes worth of gold to reimburse. This would leave a lot of creditors and a lot of debt. Another problem with this banking system was that banks eventually became stagnant. For example, if the bank previously spoken of issued out the whole 320 million banknotes it was allowed to print for the 1 million pounds of gold it had, then it wouldn't be able to loan out any more banknotes until either some of the loans were paid back or the bank acquired more gold to back more banknotes with. Robert T. Kiyosaki explained it very well in his Rich Dad, Poor Dad book series when he, in short, described how deflation drove America into the Great Depression in 1929. The currency of America was still dictated by the gold standard, and the reserves of gold were dwindling, which caused a rapid increase in the value of gold. Once the currency gained too much value through the lack of it, all commodities such as eggs or bread became dirt cheap. This was bad for business because owning one wasn't feasible, and the currency was so valuable and scarce that people would rather hold their gold than spend it on products. America's federal government had foresaw this problem years, if not decades, before the Great Depression, though. And that caused our government to concoct a plan to get people used to paper currency backed by something more plentiful than a non-renewable resource, so that the government would have more control over our economic condition. One of the steps taken was exhibited when a law was passed during Roosevelt's presidency demanding citizens to turn their gold into the federal government for a $22.50 paper dollar reimbursement for each ounce, though gold at that time was valued at $45 per ounce. In Theodore Roosevelt's time as president, the Federal Reserve's need for gold to replenish its dwindling supply had become apparent. In 1944, international banking leaders around the world gathered in New Hampshire for a meeting to discuss the banking affairs. This meeting resulted in the creation of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Later in President Richard Nixon's presidential term, Nixon, by executive order, took America off of the gold standard, and the IMF and World Bank subsequently required the rest of the world's governments, through international banking magnates and members of the two organizations previously spoken of, to separate from the gold standard as well or be excluded from these two organizations. This series of events gave America the power to essentially print a limitless amount of paper dollars and control its value by backing the dollar with the American people's obligatory promise to pay the debt. In other words, our currency became a promissory note backed by the citizens' debtor obligation. And when the World Bank and IMF got the other countries to drop the gold standard, those countries adopted the same financial backing for their countries. The way our country controls the value of domestic currency was through inflation. Inflation is the counteractive measure used by America to combat the excessive deflation of the Great Depression. With inflation, our paper dollar supply increases as the dollar's value decreases because the higher the quantity, the less of a demand for it. So whenever our government allows our banks to print up more money than the value of gross national product rendered in our country, we see inflation rise and the value of our dollar decrease because the purchasable products and services offered in our country increase in price to equalize the deficit between circulated money and gross national product. In later episodes, I'll talk more about inflation and debt, but by now, you should have gained a sufficient understanding of why the economy has seen a constant rise in inflation over the last 50 years, how this effect is governmentally inflicted, and how large spending and monetary redistribution bills passed by our government help increase inflation. As this trend continues, eventually all of the currencies of the world will become so valueless that you won't be able to buy anything with them unless you spend extremely large amounts of them for common commodities. The best example of this is the fact that at one point in time, say the 1930s, bread was valued at 25 cents per loaf, but now you would probably spend around about $3 for that same loaf, which is a dramatic increase in the amount of money that you have to pay. And the reason for that is because of inflation. So think about 70 years down the line when instead of $3, you have to pay $10 for a loaf of bread. To be conscious is to be aware, and to be aware is to be live. So with every bit of knowledge you gain, I hope you apply it in some way or relay it to someone. But as for now, I wish you peace and prosperity, and I hope you tune in to the next episode.